The Grand Chamber of the Dominion High Council was a marvel of alien architecture, an immense hall carved from obsidian and reinforced with intricate meta-inlays that shimmered under the glow of hovering energy torches. The air was thick with the scent of foreign incense, a ritualistic reminder of the Dominion's traditions. At the center of the room, a circular table large enough to seat representatives from dozens of species stretched beneath a vaulted ceiling, its polished surface reflecting the unreadable gazes of those gathered. Towering reptilian warlords, strategists with their chittering mandibles, and amphibious diplomats whose gelatinous forms pulsed in quiet rhythm all whispered among themselves, their voices a hum of anticipation. Today was a historic moment, the official induction of the Terran Republic into the Galactic Summit. The Dominion, the undisputed rulers of this part of the galaxy, had allowed humanity a seat at the table, though not out of goodwill. No, the humans had fought for this place. The Dominion had expected to crush them, to make an example of their so-called resilience, but the war had not gone as planned. Even now, some warlords shifted uncomfortably at the memory of human tenacity on the battlefield. Yet, despite their unorthodox strategies and stubborn refusal to break, the humans were still small, weak by comparison to the towering lords of the Dominion. Surely, now that the war was over and diplomacy had begun, humanity would understand its place. A deep, resonant chime signaled the arrival of the Terran representative. The grand doors at the far end of the chamber hissed open, and a single human stepped inside. He was unarmored, dressed in a crisp dark suit, and moved with an easy, almost lazy confidence. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable. He was not intimidated by the towering forms of the Dominion's ruling class. The room fell into a hushed silence, dozens of alien eyes watching as he strode toward the massive table. At its far end, an elaborate chair had been prepared, a seat befitting a ruler, positioned higher than the others. It was a quiet reminder of Dominion supremacy, a psychological test, a message that even as equals, humans would always be made to look up. The High Warlord of the Dominion, a massive reptilian figure clad in ceremonial armor, extended a clawed hand toward the seat, his voice deep and reverberating through the chamber. "Take your place, representative of Terra." James Carter, the appointed diplomat of the Terran Republic, stopped before the throne and simply looked at it. The silence stretched long as every alien in the room watched, waiting for him to climb into the oversized chair like a child struggling onto an adult's seat. But Carter merely quirked an eyebrow, then turned toward the entrance and made a subtle motion with his hand. A moment later, two human aides entered the chamber, pushing a small, collapsible chair. Without hesitation, they unfolded it and placed it directly in front of the ostentatious throne. Carter sat down, completely ignoring the Dominion's grand gesture, and crossed one leg over the other as he leaned back in effortless composure. A ripple of murmurs spread through the chamber, a mix of amusement and disbelief. Some of the representatives let out clicking laughter, while others simply stared, processing what had just happened. The High Warlord's golden eyes narrowed. A lesser species would have felt honored to sit in the Dominion's chosen seat. A lesser species would have feared insulting their hosts. But humans, it seemed, had no such concerns. One of the Dominion warlords leaned forward, his ridged brow furrowing in irritation. "Is the seat of the Dominion unworthy of you, human?" Carter exhaled softly, as if this entire exchange was tedious. He glanced up at the towering alien, then casually tapped his fingers on the armrest of his own chair. "Oh, it's a lovely chair," he said with a smirk. "Just not built for winners." The room fell into a stunned silence. Somewhere in the back, an amphibious delegate made a choking noise, barely suppressing laughter. The High Warlord's claws tightened against the edge of the table. This was not how things were supposed to go. The human was supposed to feel small, to understand the unshakable authority of the Dominion. But instead, with his simple folding chair and a handful of words, Carter had turned the entire ceremony into something else entirely, a humiliation. The Dominion had extended a show of power, and the humans had dismissed it as irrelevant. Whispers and hushed conversations spread among the gathered aliens. The humans had defied military expectations in war, and now, even in diplomacy, they refused to play by anyone's rules but their own. Some of the reptilian warlords exchanged glances, realization dawning in their cold eyes. This movement was no accident. It was deliberate, calculated. The humans had won not just through force, but through sheer defiance of expectation. A creeping sense of unease settled into the chamber. The High Warlord let out a slow breath, his tail flicking in irritation. He had thought this meeting would be the first step in reasserting the Dominion's control over the galaxy. Instead, he was beginning to realize that the humans had no intention of bending, not in war, not in diplomacy, not in anything. For the first time, he wondered if the Dominion had made a grave mistake in underestimating them. The Dominion War Council chamber was a cold, imposing structure of black stone and glowing red circuitry, its high walls lined with ancient banners from worlds. A massive circular table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by the military officials of the Dominion. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the low hum of holographic displays casting eerie shadows across the gathered warlords. At the head of the table sat High Warlord, his reptilian features drawn tight with barely contained fury. His golden eyes scanned the assembled strategists, warriors, and political advisors, searching for answers they could not give. Above them, a massive holographic projection flickered, battlefield footage looping on repeat. Every Dominion official in the room had already seen it 100 times, but they could not look away. It was a scene they had never imagined possible. The footage showed Dominion forces breaking. Elite soldiers, trained from birth for war, fleeing in disorganized chaos. Human forces advanced with ruthless precision, their movements coordinated, their firepower overwhelming. The most horrifying part was not the speed of their victory, it was the efficiency. Dominion soldiers who surrendered were ignored, left kneeling in the dirt as human forces moved past them like they were nothing. There were no grand speeches, no posturing, no hesitation. The humans fought like a species that did not care for honor or dominance. They fought to win, and that was all that mattered. In one chilling clip, a squad of human soldiers moved through a ruined city, their weapons methodically eliminating every remaining Dominion warrior who refused to surrender. Their expressions were unreadable, their eyes cold. This was not war as the Dominion knew it. It was extermination at a scale they had never faced before. Claws dug into the stone armrest of his seat. He had led campaigns against dozens of alien species, and never had he seen anything like this. The Dominion had always viewed humanity as a nuisance, an upstart race that had foolishly resisted subjugation. Now, watching the carnage play out on the holographic screen, he realized how disastrously wrong they had been. His advisors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions a mix of disbelief and barely concealed fear. One of them, a scarred general named Varos, cleared his throat. "We underestimated them," he admitted, his deep voice heavy with reluctant awe. "We assumed they would break under pressure, that they would fight as other species do, with desperation, with fear. But they are something else." Gaze snapped to him, his tail flicking against the cold floor in irritation. "Something else," he growled. "Explain." Varos hesitated, then gestured toward the looping footage. "They do not fight like us. They do not fight for territory, for prestige. They fight with a singular purpose, complete and total victory. Look at them, High Warlord. They do not revel in their slaughter, nor do they hesitate. They kill with the precision of a species that has long accepted war as a necessity, not as a glory to be earned." He paused, then spoke the thought that had been haunting them all. "They fight as if they have done this before, as if they have always known how to kill." Silence settled over the chamber. Clenched his jaw, his scales shifting slightly as he exhaled. The thought had been gnawing at the back of his mind as well. The Dominion had conquered dozens of species across the stars, and with each conquest, they had encountered resistance. Some fought valiantly but fell, others surrendered in terror, and a few dragged out wars long past the point of reason, hoping for miracles that never came. But humans? They had defied every expectation. They had adapted to every strategy the Dominion deployed. They had learned from every loss, evolving with terrifying speed. Another warlord, an olden strategist with deep scars across his snout, let out a slow breath. We believed them to be primitive, he murmured. We believed that because they lacked our technology, they lacked our strength. We forgot that technology is only a tool. They are the weapon. Rose from his seat, his massive form casting a shadow over the table. And now, he said, his voice low, we must ask ourselves the question none of us wish to face. He turned, gesturing toward the screen where the footage continued to play. A Dominion soldier knelt in the dirt, weapon discarded, eyes wide with terror. A human soldier stood before him, silent, emotionless. The soldier did not strike, did not kill. He simply looked at his defeated enemy as if he were an insect beneath his boot, then turned away, moving toward the next target. The Dominion soldier did not rise. He simply remained where he was, shaking, broken in a way no Dominion warrior had ever been broken before. Narrowed his eyes. Did we start a war we cannot win? The words hung in the air, heavy with implications none of them wished to acknowledge. The Dominion had always believed itself to be the apex predator of the galaxy, but now, for the first time in their history, they had encountered a species that did not fear them. Worse, they had encountered a species that did not even respect them as a threat. Humanity had not fought the Dominion as equals, nor as underdogs struggling against an overwhelming force. No, humanity had fought them as if they were merely another obstacle to be crushed and done foot. A deep, uncomfortable silence stretched through the chamber. The War Council, once so confident in their empire's supremacy, now sat in grim contemplation. Finally turned away from the holographic display and looked at his gathered warlords. Find me a solution, he commanded, his voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. Or we may soon learn what it means to be on the other end of an extermination. The bridge of the Dominion warship, Wrath was eerily silent, save for the hum of damaged systems struggling to maintain power. High Warlord stood motionless at the center, his golden eyes fixed on the main. The image before him was one he never thought he would see, a Dominion fleet in full retreat. Broken, scattered, humiliated. The formations that had marched across the stars and challenged now fled like frightened prey, their warships limping through the void, their hulls scorched, their weapons silent. He gritted his teeth as he watched a massive Dominion dreadnought, once the pride of the fleet, explode in the distance, its shattered remains drifting lifelessly through space. It had not been destroyed in battle, but abandoned. Scattered by its own crew rather than allowing the humans to capture it. A desperate act of defiance, but an empty van. The war was lost. Claws dug into the armrest of his command chair as he turned toward his officers. The bridge crew worked in silence, their reptilian faces tight with barely concealed fear. They had never lost a war. Not like this. The Dominion had suffered defeats before, but they had always regrouped, always crushed their enemies in the end. This time, there would be no counterattack. This time, there was nothing left to rally. His commandant stood rigid beside him, his scales darkened with soot from an earlier explosion that had rocked the ship. His voice was quiet when he spoke. We are receiving transmissions from the remaining fleet, High Warlord. They are requesting ordnance. Ordnance? Tail flicked in frustration. What ordnance could he give? He had spent his entire life leading conquests, dictating the terms of surrender to broken species who knelt before the might of the Dominion. Now, it was his people who were running, his fleet that was in shambles. He turned his gaze back to the, watching as human warships, massive, unyielding, untouched, held their positions. They did not pursue. They did not press the attack. They simply watched. As if they had already won, as if the Dominion was no longer even worth the effort of destroying. A low growl rumbled from deep within chest. This was worse than annihilation. This was humiliation on a galactic scale. The humans had beaten them so completely that they didn't even see the need to finish the job. They had reduced the Dominion, an empire that had ruled the stars for centuries, to nothing more than a fleeing, fractured remnant. Slammed his fist onto the console beside him, his claws leaving deep gouges in the metal. Aordan the retreat, he said finally, the words bitter on his tongue. Tell all remaining ships to fall back to the Dominion's peace. We will regroup at the. Commandant hesitated. High Warlord, our intelligence suggests the humans have no intention of pursuing beyond the systems they have taken. They have already begun establishing control over our former territories. If we retreat now, we may never reclaim what was lost. Turned sharply, his gaze burning into. Do you think I do not know that? He snarled. Do you think I want this? His voice was low, filled with barely restrained fury. If we stay, we die. If we fight, we die. Tell me, Commandant, do you see another option? Lowered his gaze. There was no other option. The Dominion had prided itself on never surrendering, never retreating. But the humans had broken them, had left them no choice but to flee and pray they would be left alone. Exhaled slowly, trying to steady his rage. He had studied the humans before the war. He had laughed at their history, their endless wars against their own kind, their primitive nature. He had assumed they would fight like the countless other species the Dominion had crushed before them, with fear, with desperation, with no real understanding of how to wage war on a galactic scale. But the humans had thrived in war. It was not something they feared, it was something they knew. Their history had not been a weakness. It had been preparation. They had fought wars among themselves for millennia, refining their tactics, perfecting the art of killing. When the Dominion came for them, they had not seen conquerors. They had seen prey. Clenched his jaw, his mind racing. They should have seen this coming. They should have known. But now it was too late. The Dominion was broken, its fleets shattered, its worlds lost. The only thing left to do was survive. He turned back to the van last time, staring at the human warships that hung in the void like silent specters of death. They made no move to attack. They simply let the Dominion run. And that was the final insult. The Dominion had been so thoroughly defeated that they were no longer worth killing. Straightened, his voice cold and measured as he spoke his final command. Transmit the Aordan. All ships, retreat. The chamber of the Dominion High Council was eerily silent. The great stone walls, once adorned with banners celebrating centuries of conquest, now bore the scorch marks of a war that had never reached this world, except in shame. The massive circular table at the center of the room, carved from the bones of a species once deemed unworthy of survival, was now occupied by beings who dared not look each other in the eye. High Warlord stood at the head of the chamber, his golden eyes sweeping across the gathered counselors. These were the rulers of the Dominion, the architects of expansion, the ones who had laughed at the primitive humans, dismissing them as nothing more than another footnote in their history of victories. But now, they sat in silence, their scales dull with exhaustion, their stances reduced to slumped figures weighed down by the impossible burden of failure. Exhaled slowly, his claws tapping against the table as he gathered his thoughts. He had spent his entire life believing in the Dominion's supremacy. He had led countless campaigns, crushed civilizations beneath his heel, and stood victorious on the ruins of empires that dared challenge them. And yet, the humans had destroyed everything. Not just their fleets, not just their armies, but their belief, the very foundation upon which their empire had stood for centuries. He tapped a control on the table, and the room darkened as a holographic display flickered to life. The image that appeared was one that had haunted the Dominion for months now, a recording, captured from the final battle before their retreat. A Dominion stronghold, once thought impenetrable, lay in ruins. Smoke and fire choked the air, shattered war machines lay abandoned in the streets, and in the center of it all stood a single human. His armor was but intact, his face streaked with grime and blood, none of it his own. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the battlefield without a trace of emotion. Around him, Dominion warriors lay in twisted heaps, their weapons scattered, their bodies torn apart with ruthless precision. He did not celebrate, did not revel in his victory. He simply turned and walked away, as if the battle had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Turned off the display, his voice quiet but firm. They could have wiped us out. His words sent a ripple of unease through the chamber. They had the power. They had the chance. And yet, they stopped. He let the silence stretch, watching the counselors shift uncomfortably. Tell me why. There was no answer. No one dared speak. They all knew the truth, but none wanted to say it. Finally, one of the elden counselors, his scales faded with age, cleared his throat. They see us as beneath them, he said, his voice heavy with shame. Not even worth exterminating. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. For centuries, the Dominion had ruled through fear, through sheer dominance. They had never been the ones to be dismissed. But the humans had broken them so completely that they had not even deemed them a threat anymore. That, more than the destruction, more than the lost worlds, was the true humiliation. Clenched his fists. We believed ourselves to be the apex predators of the galaxy, he said. But we were wrong. They are. His voice was cold, devoid of the arrogance that had once defined him. We mocked their wars, called them primitive for fighting among themselves for so long. But we failed to see what those wars made them, perfected killers. They have spent their entire existence evolving through conflict, refining their ways of war until it became second nature. He exhaled sharply. And when they turned their attention to us, they did not see an empire. They saw another enemy to eliminate. Another long silence followed. Some of the counselors glanced toward the exits, as if contemplating escape, though there was nowhere left to run. Finally, one of the younger warlords spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What do we do? Closed his eyes for a moment. There was only one answer. The one answer he had never thought he would have to speak. We survive. He turned to the display again, activating a star map. The Dominion's former Bayordens were marked in red, a vast empire that had once stretched across the stars. But now, space had swallowed nearly half of it, the Dominion reduced to a fraction of its former size. We will not challenge them again, he said. Not now. Not in our lifetime. The Dominion must rebuild. We must learn. Adapt. If we are to have any future, we must understand the mistake we made. The counselors exchanged wary glances. Some looked relieved, others horrified. To surrender pride, to admit inferiority, it was against everything they had been taught. And yet, the alternative was extinction. Turned away from the map, his gaze sweeping over the room one last time. The humans have given us a mercy we did not deserve, he said. But it is not kindness. It is dismissal. And if we do not change, if we do not evolve, they will not hesitate the next time. His claws scraped against the stone table, his voice dropping to a near whisper. When they may decide we are no longer beneath their notice. He let the words settle, let the weight of them press down on every soul in the room. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. He did not wait for their response. It did not matter. The truth was already written in the stars.